You will never be anything without me, he laughed, full of contempt. But she swallowed her pride, worked in silence, and built her empire. Years later, she came back richer than he could have ever dreamed. And now who's nothing? She whispered with a victorious smile. But before I tell you this story, subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching this video from. Rachel adjusted her black dress for the third time in front of the bathroom mirror at the Metropolitan restaurant. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to find some flaw in her appearance that would justify the knot in her stomach. The reflection showed a 42-year-old woman with well-groomed brown hair, subtle makeup, and a pearl necklace, a gift from her mother, the only piece of jewelry she had managed to keep after the divorce. She took a deep breath, trying to control the anxiety, consuming her. It was the first time in 5 years she would attend an important social event since Michael had left her. Not by her own choice, but because she had finally secured a job as an executive assistant at a brokerage firm after countless frustrating interviews. The company's social dinner was her chance to show she was more than just another employee. For months, she had studied the financial market in the early hours of the morning. After finishing her shift as a telemarketing representative, she knew she needed to impress, even if her current position was just an initial step. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the bathroom door opening. Through the mirror, she saw Sarah Goldman enter, the financial director of the brokerage firm and one of the most respected women in the market. Tall, elegant, in her well-preserved early 50s, Sarah was everything Rachel dreamed of becoming one day. "You must be Paul's new assistant," Sarah commented while touching up her red lipstick. "Rachel, isn't it?" Rachel felt her heart race. She hadn't expected to be recognized, much less for someone from senior management to know her name. "Yes, ma'am, it's a pleasure to meet you." Sarah observed her for a few moments through the mirror, her perceptive eyes seeming to see beyond the surface. "You've been working late these past few months. The security guards mentioned you're always the last to leave." Rachel felt her face heat up. She hadn't imagined anyone had noticed her unpaid overtime hours, dedicated to studying and understanding every aspect of the financial market. "I like to learn," she responded simply. A small smile appeared on Sarah's lips. "Paul showed me your reports. You supplemented them with analyses that weren't requested. Quite bold of you." Fear began to infiltrate Rachel's chest. She had overstepped her duties, adding observations and suggestions to the basic reports she was merely supposed to format. Her ex-husband always said she should learn to stay in her place, that her opinions only served to embarrass him. "I'm sorry if I overstepped my boundaries," she murmured, lowering her eyes. "Sorry?" Sarah laughed softly. "Darling, you just saved me months of work with that analysis on the renewable energy sector. By the way, how did you get that data on foreign capital inflow?" Rachel felt her legs weaken. During her nighttime research, she had discovered a pattern of investments that no one seemed to have noticed. "I just cross-referenced public information. I noticed there was an atypical movement of capital coming from European funds." Sarah finished retouching her makeup and turned to face her directly. "Come, I want you to meet some people." As she followed Sarah out of the bathroom, Rachel felt the gaze of several guests upon her. For a moment, she had the feeling she was living a dream, or perhaps a nightmare from which she would wake at any moment. The Metropolitan's hall was filled with New York's financial elite, people she knew only from headlines and reports. That was when she saw him. Michael was standing near the bar, accompanied by his new wife, a model 20 years younger than him. Her heart skipped a beat when she realized they would have to pass by them to reach the group that Sarah seemed to be heading toward. Michael noticed her at the same instant. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her beside Sarah Goldman, before his face assumed that expression of contempt she knew so well. Rachel felt the old fear begin to rise up her spine, his words echoing in her mind. "You'll never be anything without me." Sarah must have noticed her hesitation, for she placed a firm hand on her back. "Keep your head high," she whispered. "You're not the same person he knew." Rachel swallowed hard and straightened her shoulders. She was right. She was no longer that woman who accepted being diminished, who hid in the shadows. With each step toward her ex-husband, she felt the fear transform into something different, something she couldn't name. That was when she noticed the man who was in the group Sarah was leading her to. Tall, with grey at his temples, impeccable suit. His blue eyes, cold as ice, met hers for a brief moment. Rachel didn't know it, but that encounter would change her life forever. Sarah led Rachel to the group where the blue-eyed man was conversing with other executives. His accent revealed his European origin, probably German or Swiss, Rachel thought. He introduced himself as Nathan Weber, and his handshake was firm and prolonged. "So this is the analyst who discovered the investment pattern?" Nathan asked Sarah, without taking his eyes off Rachel. His voice had a deep and calculated tone, as if each word was carefully chosen. Rachel felt her face burn. "I only do basic analyses, Mr. Weber." "Basic?" Nathan raised an eyebrow. "You identified a movement that my analysts took months to notice, and you work as an executive assistant?" The comment made Rachel shrink internally. From the corner of her eye, she noticed that Michael and his new wife had approached the group, clearly interested in the conversation. Her ex-husband had that scornful smile she knew so well. "Rachel has a natural talent for numbers," Sarah intervened, "and an impressive ability to identify patterns where others only see disconnected data." Michael couldn't contain himself. "Rachel!" He laughed, a sound that made her stomach turn. There must be some mistake. Rachel could barely organize household bills when we were married. The silence that followed was dense. Rachel felt her face burn with shame, but before she could respond, Nathan spoke up. "And you are?" he asked, his voice carrying an icy tone. "Michael Mitchell, from Mitchell Investments," he replied, puffing out his chest. "Rachel is my ex-wife. Believe me, I know her limitations well." Nathan just observed him for a moment, like a scientist studying a particularly unpleasant species of insect. "Interesting. Mitchell Investments is the one that lost 30% of its portfolio in the last quarter, isn't it?" Michael turned pale. Rachel didn't know about this detail, though it explained the rumors that her ex-husband was having financial problems. "Normal market fluctuations," Michael responded, but his voice had lost some of its arrogance. "Curious," Nathan continued, his casual tone contrasting with the intensity of his gaze, "because the funds that followed the recommendations in Ms. Rachel's report had a 40% increase in the same period." Rachel held her breath. She had no idea her analyses had been used in this way. Sarah smiled discreetly at her side, while Michael looked like he had swallowed something particularly bitter. "Excuse me," Nathan addressed the group, "but I'd like to speak privately with Ms. Rachel. We have important matters to discuss." Before Rachel could process what was happening, Nathan guided her to a more reserved area of the hall. She could feel Michael's furious gaze on her back, but for the first time in years she didn't feel afraid. "Ms. Rachel," Nathan began once they were alone, "I'll be direct. I represent a group of European investors, and we're looking for someone with your special talent." "My talent?" she asked, confused. "Your ability to see beyond appearances, to understand the true motivations behind market movements." He paused, his blue eyes studying her intensely. "I'm prepared to offer you a position in our company. The salary would be 20 times what you currently earn." Rachel felt the world spin. The amount mentioned was more than she had ever dreamed of earning. "But I don't have experience. I don't have the necessary qualifications." Nathan smiled, for the first time since she had met him. It wasn't a warm smile, but there was something about it that intrigued her. "Qualifications can be acquired. What you have is much rarer: instinct, and with the proper training." He left the sentence hanging. That was when Rachel noticed something strange. At the table behind Nathan, she saw Robert Sanders, one of the country's biggest investors, nervously talking with Michael. Her ex-husband was gesturing heatedly, his face red with anger. "Something interesting?" Nathan asked, following her gaze. "Michael never acts like this in public," Rachel murmured, more to herself. "He always maintains his composure, especially at important events. And Robert Sanders, why does he seem so nervous?" Nathan observed her with renewed interest. "Continue." "Robert's son just took over as president of the company after he retired," Rachel continued, the pieces coming together in her mind. And Michael had been trying to close a partnership with them for months, but her eyes widened as she realized something. The numbers didn't add up. That's what was bothering me in the reports. What numbers? Nathan questioned, his voice low and intense. Rachel hesitated. What she was about to say could destroy reputations, entire lives built in the financial market. She looked at Nathan, trying to decipher his intentions. His blue eyes revealed nothing, but there was something in his posture that made her make a decision. I think I've discovered something nobody should know, she whispered. Nathan's office in New York occupied the top floor of a commercial building in the Upper East Side. Rachel observed the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows while waiting for the meeting to begin. A week had passed since the event at the Metropolitan, and her life had turned upside down. Her discovery about the inconsistencies in Robert Sanders' company's numbers was just the tip of the iceberg. Nathan had not only hired her the next day, but also arranged for her immediate transfer from the brokerage firm, with Sarah Goldman's blessing. Coffee? Nathan's voice pulled her from her thoughts. He had entered the meeting room silently, carrying 2 porcelain cups. Thank you, Rachel replied, trying to control her nervousness. It was her first official day as a senior analyst at Weber & Associates, a position that would normally require years of experience. Nathan sat across from her, placing a folder on the glass table. Have you had time to analyze the documents I sent you? Rachel nodded, taking out her own folder. She had spent the entire weekend poring over the numbers, sleeping only a few hours. The inconsistencies aren't just in Robert Sanders' company. It's a pattern that repeats in at least 5 other companies in the same sector. Nathan leaned slightly forward, his blue eyes focused on her with a disturbing intensity. Continue. They're small discrepancies, almost imperceptible if analyzed in isolation, Rachel explained, spreading some graphs on the table. But when you compare the quarterly reports with the internal balance sheets, there's a systematic difference in values. It's as if someone were deliberately doctoring the numbers, Nathan completed, a slight smile forming on his lips. Rachel felt a chill down her spine. Exactly. And the most interesting thing is that all these companies have one thing in common. They're partners of Mitchell Investments. Nathan's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. Your ex-husband seems to be at the center of something much bigger than we imagined. Before Rachel could respond, his secretary entered the room hurriedly. Mr. Weber, Michael Mitchell is here. He didn't have an appointment, but he insists on speaking with you. Rachel felt her blood freeze. Nathan, however, remained impassive. Send him in. Seconds later, Michael burst through the door, his face red with anger. He stopped abruptly upon seeing Rachel. What is she doing here? Ms. Rachel is our new senior analyst, Nathan responded calmly without getting up. Please sit down. Michael ignored the offer. You can't hire her. She has no qualifications, no experience, and more importantly, he shot a venomous look at Rachel. She doesn't have the slightest idea of how the market really works. On the contrary, Nathan countered, his voice taking on a glacial tone. She understands perfectly how the market works, including the parts that some would prefer to keep hidden. Michael paled slightly. What parts? Rachel observed the exchange between the 2 men, feeling a growing tension in the air. Nathan picked up one of the reports on the table and extended it to Michael. Perhaps you could explain to us why the official numbers of Mitchell Investments partner companies don't correspond to reality? That's ridiculous, Michael tried to laugh, but the sound came out forced. They're normal market fluctuations, nothing that an administrative assistant could understand. Ex-assistant, Nathan corrected. And I believe she understands? Very well. So well that she's already identified a systematic pattern of fraud that extends over years. The word fraud fell like a bomb in the room. Michael took a step toward the table, his fists clenched. You have no proof. Actually, Rachel spoke up, surprising herself with the firmness of her voice. I have all the necessary evidence, including the monthly deposits to offshore accounts that coincide with the dates of the altered reports. Michael spun to face her, his face a mask of fury. You ungrateful bitch, after everything I did for you. Enough. Nathan's voice cut through the air like a blade. He rose slowly, his presence suddenly filling the room. "I suggest you leave now, Mr. Mitchell, unless you prefer this conversation to continue in the presence of federal authorities." Michael backed up a step, then another. His gaze alternated between Nathan and Rachel like a cornered animal. "This isn't over," he growled, before leaving, slamming the door. The silence that followed was heavy. Rachel realized she was trembling. "Are you okay?" Nathan asked, his voice softer now. Rachel took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "What happens now?" Nathan approached the window, observing the city below. "Now, my dear Rachel, the real game begins, and you've just become a very important player." When he turned to face her, there was something in his eyes that made her shudder. It wasn't just coldness or calculation. It was something deeper, more dangerous. "But first," he continued, "we need to ensure your safety. Michael Mitchell isn't the type of man who accepts losing." The apartment Nathan arranged for. Rachel was in a discreet building in Greenwich Village. It was larger and more elegant than anywhere she had ever lived, even during her marriage to Michael. Sitting on the couch in her new living room, she leafed through a folder of documents that Sarah had given her earlier. "Your ex-husband is desperate," Sarah commented, helping herself to more coffee. She had appeared unexpectedly that night, bringing not only documents but also troubling information. "He tried to schedule meetings with all the major investors in New York today. No one would see him." Rachel looked up from the papers. "Why?" "Because Nathan Weber made some calls," Sarah responded with an enigmatic smile. "In the financial market, when Nathan Weber suggests someone might be involved in irregularities, people listen." A weight settled in Rachel's stomach. "I didn't want to destroy his life." Sarah put her cup on the coffee table with a stronger clink than necessary. "Don't be naive, Rachel. He destroyed your life first. Or have you already forgotten? The years of humiliation, the way he isolated you from everyone, how he made you doubt your own abilities." The words hit Rachel like a slap. Memories she tried to suppress came to the surface. The parties where Michael introduced her as just a housewife. The times he tore up the economics books she bought in secret. The nights she cried alone after another of his behavioral corrections. "Still," Rachel murmured, "I don't feel good being responsible for someone's downfall." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Rachel's. "You are not responsible for his downfall. Michael dug his own grave with years of fraud and manipulation. You just had the courage to expose the truth." Rachel's phone vibrated on the table. It was a message from Nathan. "Meeting tomorrow, 7 a.m. Urgent matter." "Nathan has big plans." "For you," Sarah commented, observing Rachel's reaction to the message. "He's never shown so much interest in an employee before." Rachel felt her face heat up. In recent weeks, she had spent more time with Nathan than with anyone else. He was personally training her, sharing knowledge that had taken years to accumulate. Sometimes, when their gazes met over spreadsheets and graphs, she felt something different in the air, a tension that went beyond the professional relationship. "It's nothing like that," Rachel tried to disguise. "He just saw potential in my work." Sarah laughed softly. "Nathan Weber doesn't do anything just for professional potential. He's a strategist. Every move he makes has multiple purposes." Before Rachel could respond, her phone vibrated again. This time it was a notification from a financial news portal. "Mitchell Investments under investigation. SEC probes allegations of systematic fraud." "It's begun," Sarah murmured, reading the news over Rachel's shoulder. "And this is just the beginning." Rachel felt a chill. The article mentioned that several partner companies of Mitchell Investments were being investigated, and that compromising documents had anonymously reached the authorities. "Was it Nathan?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Sarah shrugged. "Nathan never acts directly, he just facilitates things happening." Rachel's phone rang once more. It was a message from an unknown number. "You don't know who you're dealing with. Michael may have been cruel, but the new friends you've made are much worse." Rachel showed the message to Sarah, who immediately took out her own phone. "I'll let Nathan know. This changes everything." "What changes?" Rachel asked, feeling fear begin to infiltrate her veins. Sarah was already typing rapidly. "Michael wouldn't act like this alone. He must have sought help from someone more powerful, someone who isn't afraid of Nathan Weber." At that moment, the apartment lights flickered and went out, leaving the two women in darkness. The only glow came from the cell phones on the table. "Not a coincidence," Sarah whispered, her voice tense. "Rachel, grab your purse. You can't stay here tonight." In the dark, Rachel heard footsteps in the building's hallway, footsteps that seemed to be approaching her door. Sarah reacted with the quickness of someone who had faced similar situations before. In seconds, she grabbed Rachel by the arm and led her to the master bathroom, silently closing the door behind them. "Call Nathan," Sarah whispered, while frantically typing on her own phone. "Don't hang up until he answers." Rachel tried to control the tremor in her hands as she dialed. The footsteps in the hallway were closer now. Her heart raced when she heard the unmistakable sound of someone manipulating the lock on her door. Nathan answered on the second ring. "I'm 5 minutes away," was all he said, before hanging up. The creak of the living room door echoed through the apartment. Rachel covered her mouth with her hand to muffle her heavy breathing. Sarah pulled her closer, the two of them huddling in the darkest corner of the bathroom. "Ms. Rachel," a male voice called from the living room. "We need to have a conversation about some documents." Rachel recognized the voice. It was George Sanders, the son of Robert Sanders, who had recently taken over the presidency of his father's company, the same one who appeared in the suspicious transactions she had discovered. "We know you're home," another voice joined the first. "Your car is in the garage. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Sarah took a paper from her purse and quickly wrote, "Keep them talking. Nathan is coming." Rachel took a deep breath, gathering all the courage she could find. "What do you want?" she shouted from the bathroom, her voice firmer than she expected. "Just to talk," George responded, his voice closer now. "About certain analyses you've been doing. My father is very concerned about the impact they might have on the market." "All my analyses are based on public data," Rachel responded, buying time. Anyone with access to the reports could have reached the same conclusions. A bitter laugh echoed through the house. "But nobody did they? Nobody except you, an ex-housewife who suddenly became Nathan Weber's prodigy analyst." The footsteps were in the hallway now, approaching the bedroom. Rachel felt Sarah tense beside her, her hand gripping a pepper spray. "Why did Nathan Weber take such an interest in you, Ms. Rachel?" George continued. "What does he really want? Because I'm sure it's not just your skills with numbers." It was then that Rachel realized something, a piece of the puzzle that had been right in front of her eyes all along. "It's about the investments in Asia, isn't it?" she asked, her mind working quickly. "The shell companies in Singapore." The footsteps stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. "How did you—" George began, but was interrupted by the sound of the front door being violently opened. "FBI!" an authoritative voice thundered. "Everyone freeze!" Chaos ensued. Rachel heard sounds of running, shouts, and doors slamming. Sarah hugged her tightly, both of them trembling in the dark bathroom. Minutes later, which seemed like hours, the bathroom door opened softly. Nathan was there, his impeccable suit contrasting with the tension on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked, extending his hand to Rachel. She accepted his help to stand up, her legs shaky. "How did you two, I always have a plan B," Nathan responded simply. "And after you discovered the shell company scheme, I knew they would try something." Rachel looked at the living room, where FBI agents were leading George Sanders and his accomplice away in handcuffs. "I wasn't sure about Singapore," she admitted. "It was a hunch based on some strange numbers I found." Nathan observed her with a mixture of admiration and something more, something that made her heart race for reasons different from fear. "Your hunches are better than most people's certainties." Sarah emerged from the bathroom, adjusting her blazer as if nothing had happened. What happens now? Nathan didn't take his eyes off Rachel. "Now we're going to show them why it was a terrible mistake to try to intimidate us. Rachel felt something change inside her at that moment. The fear was transforming into determination. The old Rachel, the one who cowered before Michael's threats, was disappearing. In her place, someone stronger was being born, someone who was no longer afraid to confront those who tried to diminish her. "When do we start?" she asked, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Nathan's smile was almost predatory. "Immediately, because tonight was just the beginning." The meeting room at Weber & Associates was silent as Rachel presented her findings. 3 weeks had passed since the incident at her apartment, and she hadn't wasted time. On the screen behind her, graphs and spreadsheets detailed a complex network of financial transactions that extended across 3 continents. "As you can see," she pointed to a particularly complex diagram, "it's not just Mitchell Investments. There are at least 12 other companies involved in the Singapore scheme, and they all have one thing in common." Nathan, seated at the head of the table, leaned slightly forward. "Meridian Bank." Rachel nodded. "Exactly. All the suspicious transactions go through Meridian's subsidiaries in Asia, and guess who the bank's largest shareholder is?" "Albert Sanders," Sarah completed, leafing through her own documents. "George Sanders' uncle." The silence in the room grew even denser. Albert Sanders was a legend in the American financial market, known as much for his business acumen as for his political influence. "That explains a lot," Nathan commented, his voice calculatedly neutral, "including why George was so desperate to silence you." Rachel felt a shiver as she remembered that night, but maintained her composure. "The most interesting thing is that I found something they didn't expect anyone to discover." She clicked to the next slide, revealing a series of scanned documents. "These are copies of old Meridian Bank contracts from 20 years ago." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "How did you get those?" "Let's say some former bank employees became very interested in collaborating after the FBI began its investigation," Rachel explained, allowing herself a small smile. "And these documents show that the shell company scheme didn't start now. It's a practice that runs in the family." Sarah let out a low whistle. "You're saying Albert Sanders inherited the scheme from his father," Rachel completed, "and perfected it. The difference is that now they're using more advanced technology to hide the tracks, but the patterns are the same." Nathan rose slowly, walking to the window. The afternoon sun bathed New York in golden tones, making the buildings shine like gold. "Do you understand what this means, Rachel?" She swallowed hard. "That we're messing with one of the most powerful families in the country." "Not just that," Nathan turned to face her. "It means you've discovered something that even I, with all my resources, couldn't find in years of investigation." Rachel felt the weight of his gaze. There was something different there, an intensity that made her feel simultaneously vulnerable and powerful. "What do we do now?" she asked. It was Sarah who answered. "Now is when things get really interesting, because I'm sure Albert Sanders already knows we've discovered everything." As if to confirm her words, Rachel's cell phone vibrated with a notification. It was an email from an unknown sender. When she opened it, her face paled. "What is it?" Nathan asked, noticing her reaction. Rachel turned the screen so everyone could see. It was an old photo from her wedding to Michael. But it wasn't just any photo. It was one she had never seen before, taken in a private moment when she was crying alone in the garden during the reception. "How did they get this?" she whispered. Nathan approached, his fingers lightly brushing hers as he took the phone. "They're trying to remind you of who you were, the vulnerable woman they could control." Rachel felt a wave of anger replace the initial fear. "They don't know me anymore." "No," Nathan agreed, a dangerous gleam in his eyes. "They don't, but they will." Sarah picked up her purse, a determined smile on her lips. "I think it's time we paid a visit to Meridian Bank." Rachel began to gather her documents, but Nathan stopped her with a gentle touch on her arm. "First, we need to talk in private." Sarah understood the cue and left the room, leaving Rachel alone with Nathan. The silence between them was charged with unresolved tension. "You're not telling me everything," Nathan finally said. "There's something else you discovered, isn't there?" Rachel hesitated. There was in fact one more discovery, one she could hardly believe. Something that could change everything. "The scheme didn't start with the Sanders family," she said softly. "It started with someone much closer to us." Nathan remained motionless, his blue eyes fixed on Rachel. The office was bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, creating long shadows that danced on the walls. "Continue," he said simply, his voice controlled, but Rachel could feel the underlying tension. She opened her laptop and typed a series of commands. "I found this buried in old Federal Reserve files." On the screen appeared a document yellowed by time. "It's a record from 1985, an investigation that was mysteriously archived." Nathan leaned in to see better, his profile silhouetted against the window light. Rachel continued, "The name that appears here is Frederick Weber. Your father." The silence that followed was dense enough to cut with a knife. Nathan didn't move, didn't show any reaction, but Rachel noticed that his fingers slightly tightened on the edge of the table. "How did you discover the connection?" he finally asked. "The patterns," Rachel responded softly. "They're identical to what we're finding today. The same structures, just more primitive. Your father didn't just create a financial empire in Europe. He created a system." Nathan moved away from the table and walked to the window. New York stretched before him, a concrete jungle tinged with gold. "My father died 15 years ago," he said, still with his back to Rachel. "A car accident in Switzerland. At least that's what they said." Rachel felt her heart accelerate. "It wasn't an accident, was it?" Nathan turned slowly. There was something different on his face, a vulnerability she had never seen before. "The Sanders family was expanding their business to Europe at the time. My father was an obstacle." "That's why you came to America," Rachel realized, the pieces fitting together. "It wasn't just for business opportunities." "Revenge is a strong word," Nathan said, a humorless smile on his lips. "I prefer to call it poetic justice, using their own system against them." Rachel stood up, approaching him. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you need to understand who you're dealing with," he responded, his voice lowering to almost a whisper. "The Sanders aren't just corrupt bankers, they're killers." Chill ran down Rachel's spine. "And Michael? Does he know all this?" "Your ex-husband is just a piece on the board," Nathan shrugged. "Useful for his connections, disposable when necessary, as he did with you." Rachel felt the weight of those words. The memories of her marriage, which had hurt her so much before, now seemed distant, like old scars that no longer hurt. "And me?" she asked, holding his gaze. "What piece am I on this board?" Nathan took a step toward her, eliminating the distance between them. "You were never a piece, Rachel. You're the player they weren't expecting." The air between them became charged with electricity. Rachel could feel the heat emanating from his body, hear his soft breathing. For a moment, she thought he was going to kiss her. But the moment was interrupted by the shrill sound of the telephone. Nathan answered quickly, his face changing as he heard what was said on the other end. "I understand," he said dryly before hanging up. His eyes met Rachel's, now cold and calculating again. "Albert Sanders has called an extraordinary board meeting of the bank for tomorrow. They're going to try to cover everything up," Rachel concluded. "No," Nathan smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "They're going to try to destroy us, and they'll make the biggest mistake of their lives." Rachel should have felt fear. She should have wanted to retreat, to hide. But something had changed inside her. The fear had been replaced by an iron determination, a thirst for justice that she didn't even know she possessed. "When do we start?" she asked, her voice firm. Nathan observed her for a long moment, as if truly seeing her for the first time. "Right now. But first, I need you to understand one thing. Once we start, there's no going back." Rachel thought about all the years of humiliation, all the times she was silenced and diminished. She thought about Nathan's father, killed for daring to challenge the system. She thought about all the other victims who never had a voice. "I don't want to go back," she responded. "I want to move forward." Nathan's smile this time was genuine. "Then let's make history." The lobby of Meridian Bank was a monument to power and wealth. Italian marble covered the floor, and huge granite columns rose to the vaulted ceiling. Rachel crossed the space with firm steps, her heels echoing on the polished surface. The navy blue dress that Sarah had helped her choose was elegant and discreet, perfect for a board meeting. "Ms. Weber," the security guard at the reception asked as she approached. Rachel didn't correct the error. It was part of the plan. "Yes, I have a meeting with the board." The security guard consulted his list and nodded, handing her a visitor's badge. Rachel smiled internally. Nathan had taken care of all the details, including her false identity, on the guest list. In the private elevator that went up to the boardroom, Rachel mentally reviewed each step of the plan. In her folder, she carried documents that could destroy not only Meridian Bank, but the entire Sanders family. Documents she had spent the entire night organizing with Nathan. The elevator doors opened directly into the anteroom of the board. Albert Sanders was already there, talking quietly with Michael. Both turned when she entered. "What is she doing here?" Michael practically spat the words. Albert Sanders, a man in his early 60s with grey hair and astute eyes, studied Rachel with interest. "I believe there's been a mistake. This is a private board meeting." Rachel smiled, the same cold smile she had learned from Nathan. "There's no mistake, Mr. Sanders. I'm here representing the interests of Weber and Associates." "Nathan can't send a employee to a meeting of this level," Albert said, his voice distilling condescension. "Actually," Rachel responded calmly, "he can, especially when this employee has evidence that might greatly interest the other board members." Albert's face hardened. Michael took a step toward the table but was stopped by a gesture from the banker. "What kind of evidence?" Albert asked, his voice dangerously soft. Rachel opened her folder and took out a single sheet of paper. It was an old photograph in black and white. In it, a young Albert Sanders was shaking hands with Frederick Weber. In the background, one could see the date, 1985. The color drained from Albert's face. "Where did you get this?" "In the same place where I found the records of the transfer of $10 million to an account in the Cayman Islands. 2 days after this photo," Rachel responded. "The same account that was used to pay the assassin, who sabotaged Mr. Weber's car." Michael looked from one to the other, confused. "What is she talking about?" "Shut up," Albert growled at him before turning to Rachel. "What do you want?" "Me?" Rachel smiled. "I don't want anything, but the other board members, who should be arriving in a few minutes, might be interested in knowing how the Sanders family empire was really built." The sound of the elevator announced the arrival of more people. Rachel could hear voices approaching. "You're bluffing," Albert said, but there was a tremor in his voice. "Am I the one who's bluffing?" Rachel asked, taking more documents from her folder. "Or are you the one who's about to explain to the board why there are 2 different accounting books at the bank? One for the shareholders and another for the shell companies in Singapore?" The voices were closer now. Albert Sanders looked at the documents in Rachel's hands, then at the door, calculating his options. "What do you suggest?" he finally asked, his voice almost a whisper. Rachel placed another document on the table. "Your resignation letter, citing health reasons, the transfer of controlling interest to an independent board, and the end of any association with Mitchell Investments." "You can't do this to me," Michael exploded, his face red with anger. "I can," Albert responded before Rachel could speak, "and I will, because your incompetence has brought us here." The door opened and the board members began to enter. Rachel watched with satisfaction as Albert Sanders took the papers and with slightly trembling hands signed his resignation. When she left the bank an hour later, the sun was high in the sky. Her phone vibrated with a message from Nathan. "Is it done?" Rachel looked at the imposing bank building, thinking about how appearances could be deceiving, how structures that seemed unshakable could crumble when their foundations were exposed. "It's done," she responded, "but it's not over yet." Nathan's response came instantly. "I know. Come to my apartment. We need to talk." Rachel put the phone in her purse, feeling her heart accelerate. She knew this victory was just the beginning. The game was just starting, and she had learned to play very well. Nathan's apartment occupied the penthouse of one of the most exclusive buildings on the Upper East Side. Rachel had never been there before. All their previous meetings had taken place at the office. As the elevator ascended, she tried to control the whirlwind of emotions consuming her. The door opened directly into the living room, a spacious area with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a spectacular view of New York. Nathan was standing by the window, the last rays of the setting sun bathing his silhouette. He had removed his jacket and loosened his tie, a sight Rachel rarely had of him. "Wine?" he asked, without turning around. "Yes, thank you," Rachel responded, leaving her purse on a leather armchair. Nathan moved to a dark wood sideboard where he served 2 glasses of red wine. His movements were precise, controlled as always, but there was something different in his posture, an almost imperceptible tension. "Albert Sanders officially resigned an hour ago," he commented, handing a glass to Rachel. "The board has already appointed a temporary administrator." "And Michael?" Rachel asked, taking a small sip of wine. "Desperately trying to save what's left of Mitchell Investments," Nathan shrugged. "But without Meridian Bank's support, he won't last a week." Rachel walked to the window, observing the city lights that were beginning to come on. "I should feel happier about all this." Nathan approached, stopping beside her. "But you don't." "I feel empty," she admitted, "as if something is still missing." "Revenge rarely brings the satisfaction we expect," Nathan commented softly. "My father used to say it was like drinking salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you get." Rachel turned to face him. "Is that why you did all this? For revenge?" Nathan studied her for a long moment before responding. "In the beginning, yes. I spent 15 years building my position, gathering allies, looking for the perfect moment to destroy the Sanders family. And now?" "Now," he hesitated, something rare in his always confident posture. "Now I'm not so sure. You've changed a lot of things, Rachel." She felt her heart accelerate. "How so?" Nathan placed his glass on a nearby table and moved closer. "You transformed a personal vendetta into something larger. It's no longer just about destroying the Sanders or your ex-husband. You exposed an entire system of corruption." "We exposed it," Rachel corrected softly. "No," Nathan shook his head. "It was you. I was so focused on my personal revenge that I didn't see the bigger picture. You saw patterns where I only saw targets. You found connections that I had missed in my obsession." Rachel felt the weight of his words. "And that's bad?" "On the contrary," Nathan responded, his voice lowering to almost a whisper. "It's extraordinary. You are extraordinary." The air between them became charged with electricity. Rachel could feel the heat emanating from his body, see the reflection of the city lights in his blue eyes. This time, when he leaned toward her, nothing interrupted them. The kiss was soft initially, almost hesitant, so different from Nathan's strong personality. Rachel felt her hands tremble slightly when he placed them on her waist, pulling her closer. When they separated, both were breathless. Nathan rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "This complicates everything," he murmured. "Why?" "Because tomorrow begins the most dangerous phase of the plan," he responded, moving away slightly to look her in the eyes. "And now, I have even more to lose." Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. "What phase?" Nathan walked to his desk and picked up a folder. "Albert Sanders wasn't the only one involved in my father's murder. There were others, even more powerful people." "Who?" Rachel asked, though a part of her already knew the answer. "The man who really ordered my father's death," Nathan responded, opening the folder. "The same man who now controls half of the American financial market." Rachel took the documents. He offered and began to read. As she absorbed the information, her eyes widened. "My God," she whispered. "This changes everything." "Yes," Nathan agreed, his voice grave. "And that's why we need to be more careful than ever. Because this time, we're not just facing corrupt bankers. We're facing the system itself," Rachel completed, finally understanding the true dimension of what was to come. Nathan pulled her into his arms again, and she could feel his heart beating strongly against her chest. "There's still time to back out," he murmured against her hair. Rachel moved away just enough to look him in the eyes. "Would you back out?" "No," he responded without hesitation. "Then I won't either," she said firmly. "We started this together, we'll finish it together." The headquarters of the Securities and Exchange Commission in New York was in an uproar that morning. Rachel crossed the lobby beside Sarah, both carrying folders filled with documents. The past 2 weeks they had worked tirelessly, gathering all the necessary evidence. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Sarah asked as they waited for the elevator. "After we hand over these documents, there's no going back." Rachel adjusted the black blazer, a gift from Nathan. "Absolutely. It's the right thing to do." The elevator took them to the 10th floor, where the SEC director was waiting for them. Rachel knew Dr. Frank Mitchell from her research, an upright man with a 30-year career dedicated to fighting fraud in the financial market. "Ladies," he greeted them, indicating the chairs in front of him. "Sarah explained by phone that you have something important to show me." Rachel opened her folder and began to arrange the documents on the table. "What we have here, Dr. Mitchell, is proof of a scheme that extends over 3 decades. In the pie. Following 2 hours, Rachel and Sarah presented their findings. The director's face grew more grave with each new revelation. "This is extraordinary," he murmured, examining a particularly important document. "And you're certain about Secretary Thompson's involvement?" "Absolutely," Rachel confirmed. "Before becoming Secretary of the Treasury, he was the main executive of the bank that facilitated all these operations." Dr. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his gray hair. "You understand that you're accusing one of the most powerful people in the country?" "We understand," Sarah responded, "and we have all the necessary evidence." The phone on the desk rang, interrupting the conversation. Dr. Mitchell answered it, his expression changing as he listened. "I understand," he said before hanging up. His eyes met Rachel's. "Secretary Thompson has just called a press conference. In 15 minutes. Rachel felt her heart accelerate. It wasn't in the plans. The secretary was supposed to be in Washington that day. "He knows," Sarah whispered. "Somehow, he found out." Dr. Mitchell turned on the television in his office, tuning to the news channel. Secretary Thompson was already at the podium, his face a mask of rehearsed indignation. "It is with deep regret that I come before the public to denounce an attempt to destabilize the American financial market," he began. "In recent weeks, a group of foreign speculators led by Mr. Nathan Weber has been trying to manipulate our market." Rachel felt her blood freeze. The secretary continued, "I have evidence that Mr. Weber and his associates have fabricated false evidence to attack some of the most solid institutions in our country, including Meridian Bank, which has already suffered the consequences of this conspiracy." "He's inverting everything," Sarah murmured, incredulous. Rachel's cell phone vibrated with a message from Nathan. "Don't worry, we're prepared for this." But before she could respond, the secretary dropped his final bomb. "Therefore, I have just signed an order for the preventive arrest of Nathan Weber and his main collaborators, including Ms. Rachel Mitchell, for market manipulation and ideological falsehood." "Doctor." Mitchell stood up abruptly. "You need to get out of here now." "But the documents," Rachel began. "They're already digitized and secure," he interrupted her. "I'll do my job, you can be sure, but you need to protect yourselves." Sarah was already at the door, her phone in hand. "Nathan is sending a car, underground parking, 2 minutes. Rachel gathered her things quickly, her brain working at full speed. "Dr. Mitchell, there's one last thing you need to see." She took a flash drive from her purse. "Here's the final proof. The recording of the meeting where Secretary Thompson ordered the murder of Frederick Weber." The director's eyes widened. "How?" "Nathan kept this for 15 years, waiting for the right moment," Rachel explained quickly. "Use it wisely." In the elevator going down to the parking garage, Sarah held her hand. "Nathan said this could happen, That the secretary would try to destroy us before we could destroy him. Yes, Rachel responded, her voice firm. But he underestimated one thing. What? We're not the people he thinks we are anymore. I'm not that woman who let herself be intimidated. The elevator doors opened to the parking garage. A black car was waiting for them, engine running. Through the glass, Rachel saw Nathan at the wheel. Ready? Sarah asked. Rachel took a deep breath, thinking about how her life had changed in the past few months, from submissive wife to one of the most wanted people in the country, but for the first time in her life, she felt truly free. Ready, she responded, moving toward the car and the uncertain future that awaited them. The Crescent Hotel never seemed so imposing as on that night. Rachel observed its peculiar architecture through the car window as Nathan discreetly parked in the back. The annual dinner of the American Bankers Association would take place there, and all the big names in the financial market would be present. Are you sure you want to do it this way? Nathan asked, turning off the engine. In the back seat, Sarah was adjusting some equipment in her purse. Rachel smoothed her red dress, a bold and purposeful choice. I want everyone to see. I want everyone to know. The last 3 days had been a whirlwind. After Secretary Thompson's interview, they had taken refuge in a house of Sarah's on the coast, preparing every detail of what would happen tonight. The security guards have already been instructed, Sarah commented, checking her phone, and our man in the press confirmed his presence. Nathan took Rachel's hand, their fingers naturally intertwining. Once inside, you'll have only 10 minutes before they notice our presence. That's enough time, Rachel responded, gently squeezing his hand. They entered through a side door where a security guard discreetly led them through a service corridor. Rachel could hear the buzz from the main hall, where the financial elite of the country gathered, completely unaware of what was about to come. The secretary has just arrived, Sarah whispered, looking at her cell phone. He's on the main stage, about to give his speech. Rachel took a deep breath, adjusting the microphone hidden in her necklace. Then it's now. Nathan pulled her in for one last kiss, intense and quick. Remember, you're not that woman anymore. You're much stronger than they imagine. With a final nod to Sarah, who headed to the control room, Rachel walked toward the main hall. Her heart was beating strongly, but her hands were steady. Through the glass doors, she could see Secretary Thompson on stage, his arrogant smile. As he greeted the guests, the doors opened silently and Rachel entered. For a moment, no one noticed her presence. Then, like a wave, whispers began to spread throughout the hall. Faces turned, eyes widened, glasses stopped halfway to lips. The secretary was the last to notice. When his eyes finally found Rachel, his face visibly paled. "Good evening, Secretary Thompson," Rachel said, her voice amplified by the hall's sound system, courtesy of Sarah. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." The murmur in the hall increased. Security guards began to move, but a discreet gesture from the head of security, also part of the plan, kept them in their places. "Ms. Mitchell," the secretary tried to maintain his composure, though his voice trembled slightly. "I believe there's an arrest warrant in your name." "Yes, there is," Rachel agreed, calmly walking toward the stage, "just as there was an order from you 15 years ago to assassinate Frederick Weber." The silence that followed was deafening. On the huge screens in the hall, images began to appear, courtesy of Sarah in the control room. Documents, photos, bank records. "I don't know what you're talking about," the secretary tried to deflect, but his eyes were fixed on the screens. "No," Rachel smiled, climbing the steps to the stage. "Then perhaps your own words can refresh your memory." An audio began to play through the speakers. The secretary's voice, 15 years younger, was unmistakable. "Weber needs to be eliminated. Make it look like an accident. Use the account in the Cayman Islands." In the corners of the hall, Rachel could see photographers recording everything. Journalists were frantically typing on their cell phones. Secretary Thompson was paralyzed, his face a mask of shock and fury. "Security," he finally managed to shout. "Arrest this woman." But no one moved. At the entrance to the hall, FBI agents were beginning to enter discreetly, the result of the meeting with Dr. Mitchell. "It's over, Secretary," Rachel said softly, but her voice echoed through the silent hall. "You can order the arrest of me, of Nathan, of anyone, but you can no longer hide the truth." The main doors opened and Nathan entered, accompanied by Dr. Mitchell. The SEC director carried a folder that Rachel knew well, the evidence they had delivered days before. Secretary Thompson looked around, like a cornered animal. His eyes met Rachel's, and for the first time she saw fear in them. "You have no idea what you've just done," he whispered. Rachel approached him, her red dress contrasting with the secretary's dark suit. "On the contrary," she responded, her voice low but firm. "I know exactly what I did. I freed myself. And now I'm going to free everyone that you and your corrupt system tried to destroy." At that moment, Rachel heard the unmistakable sound of handcuffs closing, but they weren't for her. 6 months later, Rachel observed New York from the same place where everything had begun, the meeting room at Weber and Associates. The afternoon sun painted the sky in golden tones, so different from that first day, when she had entered as a frightened executive assistant. The door opened softly, and Nathan entered with 2 glasses of champagne. "The last of the lawsuits was dismissed today," he announced, handing a glass to Rachel. "The judge considered all the charges against us unfounded." Rachel smiled, accepting the drink. The past weeks had been intense, with testimonies, hearings, and a flood of lawsuits that were finally coming to an end. Secretary Thompson was in prison, as were several of his associates. The American financial system was undergoing the largest restructuring in its history. "Did you see the report about Michael?" Nathan asked, stopping beside her at the window. "I saw," Rachel responded softly. Her ex-husband had given an exclusive interview, admitting his mistakes and revealing even more details of the scheme. She no longer felt anger toward him, just a distant sense of pity. "Remorse is a funny thing," Nathan commented, as if reading her thoughts. "It only appears when there's no way out." Rachel turned to face him. "Do you regret anything? Having waited so long to expose everything?" Nathan considered the question for a moment. "I regret not having found you sooner," he finally answered, his blue eyes fixed on hers. "Maybe things would have been different." "Different how?" "Less about revenge, more about justice." He placed his glass on a nearby table. "You changed everything, Rachel. Changed the way I saw things, the way I saw life." Rachel felt her heart accelerate. Even after all these months, Nathan still had this effect on her. "You changed me too," she admitted. "You helped me find a strength I didn't know I had." "No," he disagreed softly. "The strength was always there. You just needed a chance to show it." The sound of heels in the hallway announced Sarah's arrival, who entered the room with a radiant smile. "I just received confirmation. The board approved unanimously." Rachel felt a wave of emotion pass through her. After months of work, her financial market restructuring project had been approved. New transparency rules, stricter control systems, protections for small investors. Everything she had dreamed of implementing. "Congratulations, Director," Nathan smiled, raising his glass in a toast. The title still sounded strange to Rachel, Director of Compliance and Governance of the newly created Financial Market Reform Commission, a position she had earned on her own merit, not through connections or influence. Sarah approached, also raising her glass. "The woman they said would never be anything without a man by her side is now one of the most respected people in the market." Rachel thought about her journey, the nights studying alone, the humiliations she faced, the fear she had to overcome. "You know what's most ironic?" she commented. "Michael was right about one thing. I would never be who I am today if I had stayed with him." "And now?" Nathan asked, his voice soft. "What does the most powerful woman in the financial market plan to do?" Rachel smiled, looking at the city that stretched before her. "Continue changing things, not for revenge, not for power, but because it's the right thing to do." Nathan pulled her close, his arms encircling her waist. "And us? What do you plan about us?" Rachel raised her face to look at him. In the blue eyes that had once seemed so cold to her, she now saw warmth, affection, and something deeper that needed no name. "We," she responded, "are going to write our own story. Without manipulations, without games, without revenge, just the truth. Sarah discreetly left the room, gently closing the door behind her. The sun was beginning to set, painting the New York sky in shades of pink and gold. "I knew you would be special from the first day," Nathan murmured, his lips brushing hers. "But I never imagined how much you would change my life." Rachel smiled against his lips. "We changed each other, and now we're going to change the world." The kiss that followed was soft, full of promises. Down below, the city continued its frantic rhythm, unaware that, in that room, a new era was beginning. An era of transparency, justice, and above all, of a woman who discovered that her greatest strength was precisely in what others had tried to use to diminish her: her ability to reinvent herself. And when the lights of New York began to come, on one by one, Rachel knew with absolute certainty that she had finally found her place in the world, not as someone's shadow, not as a victim, but as the protagonist of her own story. A story that was just beginning.